From non-alignment to strategic autonomy. From dehyphenation to strategic partnerships. India has always exhibited diplomacy relevant to each era. Will New Delhi answer the call of these times and clearly define allies and adversaries? Join me, Palki Sharma Upadhyay, to watch the Gravitas US Edition, live from Washington, D.C.
Gravitas live and direct from WION Studios in Washington, D.C.
Hello and welcome to Gravitas USA Direct. It is 9 p.m. in India, 11:30 a.m. here in Washington, D.C. and we are coming to you live from across the White House, where preparations are on in full swing to host India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He's scheduled to land in the United States in 3 days from now. He'll be in the U.S. Capitol, and we are here to tell you all about the build-up, what to expect from the upcoming bilaterals, the first ever in-person Quad meeting, and today we're starting with history. The Cold War, to be precise. Back then, India believed in non-alignment, meaning the refusal to take sides between two opposing blocs. India refused to take sides with either the Soviet Union or the United States. New Delhi chose to maintain neutrality. As years passed, India adopted strategic partnerships, alliances based on strategic convergence. You can say that India has exhibited diplomacy relevant to the era. Now is the era of the Wuhan virus pandemic. It calls for clear definitions, defining the good from the bad, the allies from the adversaries. You cannot operate in ambiguity. You cannot exhibit hesitancy. These definitions, these lines can help shape new dynamics, new alliances based on convergence, and a future leadership role based on creative diplomacy. So this is the question that we're asking today. Is India ready to define its allies and adversaries? Joining me in our Washington studios is Patrick M. Cronin. Is the Asia Pacific Security Chair at Hudson Institute, also former senior advisor and Senior Director of the Asia Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, and before that, a Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Also with me is Atman Trivedi. He is the Managing Director at Hills & Company. Atman has been U.S. Special Envoy on Climate John Kerry's Council on India and Southeast Asia. He has also served as the Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Gentlemen, welcome to Gravitas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We are calling this panel discussion India, Allies and Adversaries, and there's a reason why we want to start with this. Many believe that for India to expand its global footprint, it must clearly define its allies and adversaries. Do you agree?
I think India in the last few years has begun this process of definition that you're talking about. And in part, that's a response to the external environment in which it's dealing with. The biggest development may have been the situation in the high Himalayas, of course, the conflict that broke out in the Galwan Valley about a year ago, and the subsequent tensions that still linger with China. And so I think that has hastened a natural alignment with the U.S. and the West on a number of different issues. So here, when the Prime Minister comes, I think we'll see that the sides are seeing more eye to eye than that they ever really have. Here in the U.S., there's strong bipartisan support, Democrat and Republican, for the U.S.-India relationship.
Patrick, they say in diplomacy there are no permanent allies or adversaries, there are only permanent interests. And yet, can those interests be served well if you do not clearly define or spell out who your adversaries are?
Well, you better have your objectives clearly in mind if you hope to pursue them and achieve them. And there's no doubt that over the last year, largely because of China's actions, the quadrilateral security partners of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States have moved in closer alignment, not just the problem solving of vaccines or supply chain security, but I think maritime security and other questions that get into the hard security realm where everybody's been wary of making this a formal alliance. It's not heading there yet. But if China keeps pressing India and Australia and Japan and the United States, who knows where this could end up. I think we're seeing a new variable geometry in the Indo-Pacific. The quadrilateral security arrangement is just one mechanism, but it's sort of a muscular hub for maritime democracies who pose a latent threat. That is, if they were to come together seriously as an alliance in future, they would be a dominant security apparatus. But there are other minilateral, trilateral arrangements that are obviously brewing. Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States is one, but Japan, Australia, the U.S., and so on. And these arrangements are all trying to achieve specific goals, problem solving. Whether it's the maritime security, the Malabar exercise that India has helped to lead with others, or whether it's the submarine deal with Australia and the UK, these are specific questions. And the Quad is still focused on delivering on specific challenges like, again, vaccination. If they can help the world get vaccinated, not just Southeast Asia, that will be a huge public good for everybody. And it's not at China's expense. It's for the good of the world. So it's not all about adversaries, but it is definitely knowing about what your objectives are.
And yet the Quad, since you mentioned the Quad, has not been able to clearly define and spell out what their objectives are. You mentioned the Malabar exercise. It took forever for India to get Australia on board.
Yes.
So when you're talking about alliances, and then we have the US, you said that there's a lot going for this alliance, but we know how things are going between America and one of its oldest allies, France, at the moment, and especially under Donald Trump, but even with Joe Biden as president, I think there's been a lack of confidence in America as an ally at some level. So what should India be looking at when it sets out to define who is an ally and how much you're prepared to give?
Well, I think, as Patrick rightly pointed out, it's a question of being clear about what India's interests are. But, when you're talking about security, prosperity, the U.S. is still very much the partner of first choice, I think, in the world. What the U.S. can offer in terms of defense capabilities, technological know-how, the ability to work together on shared economic issues and encourage prosperity through working together on trade. I think there's just a tremendous amount there that is on offer from the United States. And, the U.S. has come to the assistance of India quietly during some of its challenges with China. There have been very robust consultations that have taken place in the last few weeks regarding Afghanistan and our shared concerns about counterterrorism. I think when the United States has a national interest at stake, you can count on the United States to be a credible, faithful ally and partner.
You mentioned defense. I think a test of that would be once the S-400 missile defense system is delivered, and will CATSA be invoked against India or not? That's one of the questions that's being asked there. But if we talk about China, for instance, China and India have not had the best of times over the last couple of years. And yet China remains the biggest trading partner for India. How do you navigate the two when you're bracketing countries as allies or adversaries, or should you be content with calling some just competitors?
Well, I think China is complicated, and therefore it can't just be a competitor. It can't just be a state you're looking for trade and cooperation from either. And it's not all about confrontation, but sometimes there needs to be some confrontation, as there was on the border, India fighting back for its own sovereignty when China's pushing on its frontiers, because they're testing to see whether from the South China Sea or the Himalayas, whether others will push back. That's where the alliance doesn't have to be a sharp choice. It's a matter of standing for the rules-based system and saying, hey, we're four maritime democracies who share common interests. We all want trade relations with China, but let's not be overly dependent on China, especially when it comes to the most sophisticated high technology, or make sure that we can secure our supply chains. And that's where I think there's some sort of pullback from the Chinese trade, and yet everybody wants to preserve as much good trade and fair trade as possible. So they want a fair and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. It's really a shared goal, but China is making it very difficult right now from the perspective of, I think, India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. We all share this sort of common concern about how China is using its power, especially Xi Jinping, as he also consolidates unprecedented control internally and looks forward to a third term as General Secretary of the party next year. This is a concern about how China in the future is going to behave, not just on its periphery, but throughout the Indo-Pacific and internationally. That's why the relations here with the Quad are so important. That's why the White House summit is so important, that these four leaders are symbolically coming together saying, we're taking the next step to stand together for a rules-based order that isn't perfectly defined, but we know that we have to work on this together. We can't just let one country unilaterally and coercively rewrite the rules.
Right, and I'm not a fan of Xi Jinping, and I know what you're talking about when you say that he's consolidating his rule, but the fact is that this, for instance, the Uyghur crackdown had been happening for years. There's also a criticism that the West uses human rights as a stick to beat countries with once they're on the wrong side of
well, I think, I'd push back on that. Yes, the human rights can be inflated or deflated depending on the issue at the time. But I'd say the Uyghur crisis has pretty clearly become a global major humanitarian disaster. And you can say that China pushed back when they had an act of terrorism in 2017, and that sort of escalated their move toward concentration, toward these detention camps and re-education and surveillance state. But they've gone into overdrive in China, in Xinjiang, over the last 4 years, and there's no doubt about that. So it is important for India and the United States and other countries to speak out for people who have no voice in this and who are being hurt, killed, censored, their culture eradicated, whether you call it genocide or not. And there are technical definitions for this, and that's where people can argue over this. The human rights dimension of this is real and tragic.
Right. And for some reason, India has also been called the weak link in the Quad, and India is breaking from tradition in being so obviously and clearly part of an alliance that is being seen as something that should contain China. Of course, the AUKUS has taken the heat off some of that, and it's not being seen as the Asian NATO. We have a new Asian NATO, apparently. But the other player in this equation is Russia. How do you see India's relationship with Russia, the biggest defense partner, and at the same time also a country that is gradually and clearly moving closer to China?
The India-Russia relationship is evolving, and it's gotten more complicated, I think, in recent years. You can see that in Afghanistan, where Russia and India used to be more closely aligned in supporting the Northern Alliance historically. But Russia, its interests are separating a little bit, whether it's on Afghanistan or whether it's China's role in the Indo-Pacific, or whether it's questions of a robust rules-based order. India and Russia are less close than they were historically. I think the relationship is still quite important for India. Russia is a supplier of arms historically, although here too that's starting to change the overall trend line in terms of the U.S. and other Western countries stepping up to help India on defense issues. Sell. Partner together. But also I think there's some concern about how close Russia and China have gotten in recent times, and that's kind of motivating India as well. And so there are elements of continuity and cooperation that are there from that Cold War times, but increasingly there are also elements where the two countries don't see eye to eye on security and other issues.
Right. Before I wrap, then, I want to, as we look forward to this week and what the Indian Prime Minister says and other leaders say, and it'll help us understand which way and which direction India wants to pursue. Is it possible and is it feasible in this current geopolitical scenario to pursue conflicting alliances and make them work?
It is a messy world, and I don't expect it to be cleaned up anytime soon. That's all right. We're not heading again toward necessarily a bipolar Indo-Pacific. It's more this variable geometry that I'm talking about. And you can throw into that mess sort of the multilateral trade agreements, RCEP and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and other arrangements. So there are lots of different ways, including through the ASEAN sort of institutions, for us to work with China and work with Russia even, and also to compete with them. And I think India and the United States and Japan and Australia have an increasing and abiding interest to cooperate on what they believe in and their values and their interests, because if they don't, then it will be made in Beijing by others. And I don't think they want to do that. So that means, yeah, we're not at an alliance yet, but we are moving in closer alignment, but trying to focus on specific problem solving again. The more specific we can be, the more real we can keep quadrilateral action, the more people will see the benefit of it in India, in the United States, and around the world. China, China's foreign minister famously, Wang Yi said that this was nothing but sea foam. Now he says it's a threat. I think maybe the reality is it's somewhere in between. It's not a threat to China. It's not sea foam. It's actually practical cooperation from big four maritime democracies.
Very interesting. Your thoughts before we end. Do you see a shift in India's approach in the week ahead?
Well, I think in general, India has been tilting more and more westward because of changes in its immediate security environment. But at the same time, I think India is fairly comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. I think MEA sees an opportunity to vindicate its interests and extend Indian values through various aspects of partnerships, whether it's the Quad here this week, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, whether it's the BRICS. It's about finding ways to advance India's interests. Very quickly on the Quad, this is not so much a hard power defense arrangement against China. This is about pragmatic cooperation that can benefit the peoples of the four countries, and that can also advance the priorities, whether it's COVID-19 and pandemic relief, whether it's dealing with climate change, more resilient supply chains. It's about doing practical stuff that can really address the needs of the people and the people in the broader Indo-Pacific region and the world.
Yes, and yet I think that they need to define their purpose more clearly. Last year they met the foreign ministers. They could not even come up with a joint statement. They said that's not the Quad tradition. I'm hoping we'll see something more than that.
I think we will see some more clarity this week at the White House.
Hopefully.
We saw a first ever Quad joint statement coming out of the first ever virtual leaders interaction. They're meeting together for the first time, making history all together. So I think we're moving in the direction you want to go in.
Let's see. Thank you very much, Atman, Patrick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gravitas live and direct from WION Studios in Washington, D.C.
The era of non-alignment is over. India wants to be an influencer on the world stage, and it is reinventing its approach, beginning to take a stand where it matters and making tough choices. This week we'll see some of that happening, which is why we are here to track the moves and the meetings that will define India's relationships with the world, that will determine India's place in the new world order. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, will be in Washington, D.C. and New York. He'll meet world leaders, he'll engage with key stakeholders, he will speak his mind on the issues that matter. And we can tell you that WION is the biggest team on the ground with 10 reporters in D.C. in New York, and we will cover all the developments as they happen. Our next report tells you what you can expect this week.
It cannot get bigger than this. 1 week of action-packed events, agenda-setting speeches, and high-powered diplomacy. The focus will be on India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He has a number of bilateral engagements lined up. The first stop will be Washington, D.C. The Indian Prime Minister will arrive on the 22nd of September. On the 23rd, he'll sit down with his Quad counterparts, Prime Minister Scott Morrison of Australia and Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga of Japan. On the 24th of September, Prime Minister Modi will meet U.S. President Joe Biden at the White House. The two leaders will come face to face for the first time after Biden's victory last year. Three pressing issues top the agenda. Number 1, the security situation in Afghanistan. Number 2, the Wuhan virus pandemic. And number 3, the implication of AUKUS, the latest security pact of the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia. The bilateral talk is expected to last 15 minutes. US Vice President Kamala Harris is also expected to attend. After that sit-down, both leaders will join the first ever in-person Quad Summit. 5 issues will dominate these discussions. Tensions in the Indo-Pacific, connectivity and infrastructure projects, vaccine manufacturing, critical technologies like 5G and chip manufacturing, and climate change. Later in the week, the action will shift to New York for the United Nations General Assembly. Prime Minister Modi will address world leaders on the 25th of September, his 4th speech in 7 years as Prime Minister. India is expected to use this opportunity to raise its voice on a number of global issues. The list includes terrorism, climate change, equitable and affordable access to vaccines, tensions in the Indo-Pacific, and reforms at the United Nations. Prime Minister Modi is expected to meet more world leaders on the sidelines. The world will be closely watching his interactions, and WION has put together the biggest reporting team on the ground to track every event.
The Prime Minister of India will reach Washington, D.C. on the 23rd of September. As we wait for his arrival, it's slightly tough to ignore the not-so-discreet activities of a delegation from India's neighbourhood, which seems to be working overtime to push its same old propaganda, but with new vigour. The delegation is from Pakistan. It landed in New York on Sunday to build its case against India on Kashmir. Yet again, you must know that Pakistan has been a member of the United Nations General Assembly for almost 74 years now, 7 decades plus. And it has spent all of these years on one mission, seeking parity with India on Kashmir. 74 long years, all of those efforts have failed, we can say, but why do they fail this time will be different? Well, first of all, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, is not part of the delegation. He's not coming to the US. After all this, he's still waiting for that phone call from US President Joe Biden. 7 months, no luck yet. And the not so small matter of finding a free ride to New York. You see, the last time he traveled to the United States in 2019, he took Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's private jet. Apparently, MBS did not want him to take a commercial plane, so he lent his VIP Boeing 747 jumbo jet to Imran Khan. Well, this time he's made no such gesture. All things considered, it makes sense for Imran Khan to not come here in person, so he's going to address the United Nations General Assembly virtually through a pre-recorded video message that will be aired on the 24th of September. Meanwhile, his foot soldiers are here and they're expected to do the rest. Who are these individuals? Well, the usual suspects: Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, who's leading the Pakistani delegation, and Shahryar Afridi, the chairman of Pakistan's so-called Parliamentary Committee on Kashmir. Upon his arrival in New York on Sunday, Shahryar Afridi posted this. Allow me to quote from what he said. Landed in New York to sensitize international audience on unabated genocide, war crimes by Indian occupational forces in Jammu and Kashmir, but was taken aback by malicious propaganda by evil forces and pro-India stooges. Unabated genocide, war crimes, evil forces. Makes one wonder if he's talking about Pakistan. Also, what exactly is Mr. Afridi taken aback by? A security check. That's what he did not mention. Look at the headline. Pakistan's Dawn is reporting that Shahryar Afridi was stopped at New York's JFK airport after he, quote-unquote, failed to satisfy immigration officials. He had to undergo secondary screening and was reportedly questioned for about an hour. American authorities gave him permission to enter New York only after the Pakistani consulate in the city confirmed his credentials. Now, Mr. Afridi says that this is the work of quote-unquote pro-India stooges. It's almost funny that Pakistan thinks that India is behind the smallest of troubles it faces. Its own attempts to defame India notwithstanding, the Pakistani delegation has not landed in New York empty-handed. They've brought along with them an anti-India dossier, a dossier that is not worth the paper it's printed on. It was released on the 13th of September by Pakistan's Foreign Ministry in Islamabad, and we reported on the timing of this dossier and how Pakistan plans to use it against India at the United Nations General Assembly. And we're not too sure if they'll find any takers for this. This dossier is a shoddy attempt at comic fiction, if I may say so. It accuses India of running terror camps for the ISIS, the Islamic State. Pakistan, a theocratic terror state, is accusing India, the biggest and the most diverse democracy in the world, of running camps for an Islamist terror group. That's what they're saying. And Pakistan is keeping its hopes high. It thinks this dossier will help build a counter-narrative against India on Kashmir, and it is trying to, quote-unquote, sensitize the international audience in advance. It's unlikely to generate substantial diplomatic support, or any support for that matter, unverifiable information, inconsistencies in evidence, and not to mention a variety of spelling mistakes being a few reasons. This dossier is forensically dead, as is Pakistan's counter-narrative against India. Arriving first in America does not add legitimacy to its cause. If anything, it reveals Pakistan's desperation to avoid getting called out on the global stage at any cost. The UNGA week is crucial for every US president. While other world leaders are guests, the US president is at home. He is the undeclared host, or in Joe Biden's case, the embattled host. Things are not looking good in the US. The Wuhan virus is back with a vengeance. There is a migrant crisis at the border. Allies are second-guessing Biden's leadership, and his legislative agenda is at a dead end. As I said, embattled. Let's start with the Wuhan virus. Here's what Joe Biden said on the 4th of July, almost 80 days back. Today, we are closer than ever to declaring our independence from a deadly virus. It was a big moment for President Biden. He was hosting a party at the White House. There were fireworks in the backdrop. Talk about a premature celebration. Let me show you the situation 3 months on. Daily deaths have reached 2,000 again. Every day, 2,000. 99% of the cases are the Delta variant. The fourth wave is well and truly here. What about vaccinations? More bad news on that front. Anti-vaxxers are dominating the narrative in the US. A new poll says 28% Americans do not plan to get vaccinated. That's more than a quarter of the population, 28%. What is Joe Biden's strategy? Vaccine mandates. He's making it mandatory for large businesses to vaccinate their employees. It's a good move. Just one problem. The Republicans are not on board. Big states like Florida and Texas are already challenging the mandate. They say it is presidential overreach. Biden's challenge number 2, the migrant crisis. These pictures are from Del Rio, Texas. Thousands of migrants have gathered here. They've crossed rivers. They've walked dozens of kilometers, evaded border patrol, and have now pitched their tents at the border. Most of them are Haitians. They say life is impossible back home in Haiti, so they have come to the border in search of the American dream. And what does the Biden administration do? Expel them.
We're working around the clock to expeditiously move migrants out of the heat elements and from underneath this bridge to our processing facilities in order to quickly process and remove individuals from the United States consistent with our laws and our policies.
How generous of them. Away from the heat and back to poverty in their homeland. The fact is, Biden has a moral obligation to help these people. The US spent decades destabilizing Central America. The CIA plotted coups and assassinated elected leaders. So these people are fleeing the hell that America created. Challenge number 3, unhappy allies. The list is getting longer. France has recalled its ambassador to Washington, D.C. They're calling the AUKUS partnership a betrayal.
There have been lies, there has been duplicity, there has been a major break of trust, there has been contempt. So it's not going to be well between us, not at all. That means there is a crisis. And at that point, there's first a symbolic aspect, meaning we are recalling our ambassadors to try to understand, but also to show our former partner countries that we have very strong discontent, really a serious crisis between us.
Remember, France is America's oldest ally. Dumping them in public was always a bad idea, and now Biden is frantically trying to patch things up. He's scheduled to speak with President Macron this week, but the damage is already done. Plus, this is not an isolated incident. Allies do not think that Biden is the man for the job. Here's what former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Facebook.
You know, Bennett met with Biden.
I heard that Biden was very attentive at this meeting. He dropped his head in agreement.
Netanyahu may be out of power, but that doesn't mean that he's out of the reckoning, and it doesn't make it any better for Joe Biden. A key ally is publicly ridiculing him. He's saying that Biden dozed off during a meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. Now, Reuters has apparently fact-checked this claim, and they say that Biden was not actually sleeping. But the Sleepy Joe tag seems to have stuck. Even Elon Musk is having a go at him. You know things are not going well when an eccentric billionaire is taking shots at you. Challenge number 4, a domestic deadlock. Joe Biden is pushing a $3.5 trillion spending plan. His entire presidency rests on this funding. His climate agenda, his infrastructure plan, and his social security proposals. But passing this will not be easy. Even Democratic senators say the plan is too lavish. Add gun laws and abortion, and you have a deadlocked Congress. Joe Biden promised bipartisanship and unity. Yet America is more polarized than ever. So Joe Biden's UNGA debut will not be a smooth ride. Allies are demanding answers, migrants are amassing at the border, and his campaign promises look like a distant dream at the moment. Can this embattled president take charge of the world? Is Biden's UNGA dream over before it began? We'll track the story throughout the week for you. We are bringing you this broadcast live from Washington, D.C., a city that offers the most interesting experience about American history. It's one of the few places in the world to be named after a leader, George Washington, the first president of the United States. In 1790, he picked this location as America's permanent seat of governance. He also oversaw the construction of the White House. And since then, Washington, D.C. has seen it all: wars, conflicts, revolutions, and compromises. It has also seen people from across the world leave an indelible mark on its identity, cultures that have provided this city with a complex yet distinctive character. Over the weekend, we set out to experience all of this firsthand, and here's what we saw. It was established on July 17, 1790, after a bitter compromise between members of the U.S. Congress who fought for 7 years to define the concept of a federal enclave. Washington is named after the founding father and the first president of America, George Washington, who chose this as America's permanent capital. It was built on land ceded by the states of Maryland and Virginia. But since then, Washington has constantly expanded beyond its original boundaries. It has also been constantly rebuilt. In 1812, America declared war on Great Britain. And 2 years later, the Brits invaded Washington. They set fire to federal buildings in the vulnerable capital. The city was burned to its knees. Also burnt was the White House, the Capitol, and the Congress Library. Washington had to be rebuilt. It was decorated with pieces from American history, which stand firm to this day, narrating the stories of the good times and the bad. This is the Depression breadline sculpture. It was created in 1991, and it reminds the world of one of the darkest periods of American history, the story of the Great Depression. These are men standing in a line waiting for food. This was a time when thousands of men and women like these would stand in queues outside churches and soup kitchens, hoping to feed themselves and their families. Washington, D.C. also features memorials of the greatest of men and women born on the American soil. Like the Lincoln Memorial, dedicated to its 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. It is one of the city's landmark structures. There's also the Jefferson Memorial, named after the third U.S. president, Thomas Jefferson. The Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, and the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. Interestingly, the city also features a Mahatma Gandhi Memorial. It was established by the Government of India, and it's located right across the street from the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. The Gandhi Memorial is just one example. People and cultures from across the world have left an indelible mark on this city's identity, providing Washington, D.C. with a distinctive character. In a city filled with war memorials, this statue stands to tell the story of Indian values of peace and non-violence. This is Palki Sharma Upadhyay reporting for WION from Washington, D.C. That was the update from Russia. Now it's time for your daily dose of global news. It's time for Gravitas Global Headlines.
With climate change expected to top the agenda at the 76th UNGA session, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres gave a clarion call for climate action.
Coming together to save our planet and each other.
Laying out a 5-point sustainable development agenda for 2030. Islamic State Khorasan, or ISIS-K, claimed weekend attacks against the Taliban in the Afghan city of Jalalabad. The terrorist group says that more than 35 Taliban militia members were killed or injured in the explosions, according to reports. The Indian Defense Minister Rajnath Singh spoke to his U.S. counterpart Lloyd Austin and discussed bilateral defense cooperation and regional matters, including the situation in Afghanistan. This comes ahead of the crucial meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden in Washington. At least 6 people killed and 6 injured in a campus shooting at Russia's Perm State University after a student opened fire at the campus before being apprehended by the security forces. The Indian Health Ministry announced the resumption of exports of surplus COVID-19 vaccines in October. The Indian government had supplied over 66 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines to more than 70 countries as part of the Vaccine Maitri initiative earlier this year. France cancelled a meeting between its defense minister and British counterpart amid the row over Australia scrapping the submarine order with Paris. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson plays down the rift, saying his country's love for France is ineradicable. Lava continues to flow from a volcano that erupted in Spain's Canary Islands off northwest Africa, destroying about 1,000 houses and leading to evacuation of over 5,000 people. The U.S. is racing against time to save the United States' sequoia trees as wildfires spread to California groves. The giant trees have been covered in fire-resistant foils. Real Madrid have gone 2 points clear at the top of La Liga with a come-from-behind 2-1 win away to Valencia. The visitors were outplayed for long stretches and fell behind in the 66th minute. But 2 late goals from Vinicius Jr. and Karim Benzema gave Real the 4th win from 5 league games. Max Homa has won the PGA Tour's season-opening event in Napa, California by 1 shot for his 3rd career title. The 30-year-old American started the final round 2 shots off the pace, but surged past overnight leader Maverick McNeely with a 7-under round that featured an eagle and 3 birdies on the back 9.
And with that, it's a wrap on the first edition of Gravitas US Direct. Through this week, we are broadcasting live from America. Tomorrow on the show, we will tackle the biggest story of this year, Afghanistan, America, and South Asian security. That's what we'll discuss. The world's attention may have shifted away, but we haven't taken our eye off Afghanistan. Just today, in fact, Afghan high school girls took to the streets. What were they protesting? They can see their rights slowly slipping away from their hands. The Taliban have issued a new diktat, yet another diktat for the women in Kabul and elsewhere. Female government employees have been asked to stay at home. The Taliban say women can only do those jobs that cannot be done by men, a clear attempt to segregate and push women out of public life. Meanwhile, there's been another terrorist attack. The Islamic State Khorasan has targeted the Taliban with a series of bombings. They happened in Jalalabad, that's eastern Afghanistan. Reports say more than 25 members of the Taliban have died. So women's rights are being crushed, and terrorist attacks continue unabated. And the US, embarrassed by its botched-up withdrawal, wants to shift the attention of the world. How will an unstable Afghanistan change South Asia? We'll discuss this and more on Gravitas tomorrow. Make sure you don't miss that show. Signing off from Washington, D.C. with Gravitas Images. Thanks for watching.